Hello and welcome. My name is Walid Meh. I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Imagine you're deploying a new cloud app and you need it to access sensitive resource securely, without juggling passwords or secrets. What if you could give your app its own identity, assign it just the right permissions, and manage everything with few clicks? That's the power of Azure Roles and Managed Identities. In this session, you'll discover how Role-Based Access Control, RBAC in short, and Managed Identities work together to simplify security, automate access, and keep your environment safe so you can focus on innovation, not credentials. Let's get started. Right, let's jump onto a whiteboard to understand some details. So far in this course, if you've been watching other videos, we have been talking about a lot of things within Entra ID. Now, typically when we talk about Entra ID, we look at details like, hey, my Entra ID has its own tenant details. So under the tenant that we create, we will have some settings like I could create a role for a user, and I can define different roles for different reasons. Let's assume the very first role that we speak about is Global Administrator. This is a role that's assigned to the highest level of access in my environment to a user. And there are many other roles that we can look into working with in my environment. Now, for this part of the session, we are going to simply draw a line over here and suggest for just a few moments, let's consider talking about something else. And let's bring this to just one side of the screen. What are we jumping onto right now? Well, we are talking about Azure and discussing Azure resources. So in Azure, if we are going to go and work with creating resources, how does that look like and what do we do with them? So this is my Cloud Vault for Azure. For a few moments, leaving Entra out of the story completely. Now, typically when you're working with my cloud resources in Azure, first of all, you need to understand the scope of different levels that we have within Azure. At a very high level, we'll have something what we refer as management groups. Then we can look drilling down into a little bit more to say, hey, within these management groups, I typically have a subscription or more subscriptions. And these subscriptions may or may not belong to one or belong to one or other management group. Now, within my subscription, typically I'll go and create a resource group. And this resource group will belong to a subscription. And within the resource group, I'll drop in my resources. Now, these resources can be anything they can imagine that you can create in Azure environment. This could be a virtual machine. This could be your IoT resource. This could be your machine learning. This could be your artificial intelligence resource, and many other things that you can create within Azure environment. So that becomes my scope of things that I can define different level in my environment. Now, what we are going to discuss right now is identity and access management on my resources in Azure environment. For me, these are the 4 levels of scope that I get to choose when I'm implementing identity and access management. I can control who gets access at what level within my organization based off some of these areas and define, hey, you can only look at just one resource and work with me on that resource. Or I bring you into a resource group and everything that's within that resource group you have access to with me and you can work and collaborate with me on that. Or I can jump up again within the scope to go up a subscription level, which gives them access to everything, and a management group level. So this is where it will become as my scope of where I assign that access for someone. Now, if I'm looking to assign a user access, again, we can begin with users. We can assign this to quite a few other resources like service principals and giving it to groups as well. But just for this scenario, let's assume that I am looking to assign a user some sort of an access to my environment. Now, typically, let's assume me going to go create a resource in my environment. I'll go and create a simple resource like a virtual machine. Because I created this virtual machine, I become the owner of this resource. Now, this is a role for Azure environment. So this is my RBAC role. So this is a role-based access control role that I am assigning, or I get given, because I created a resource. I'm the owner, which gives me the highest level of access inside of Azure on a resource. Being an owner, I can perform any task to this resource. I can create it, I can delete it, I can edit it, I can give others permissions to come and collaborate with me on this. Again, it's a control that I have being the owner of the resource. Now, so far, this has nothing to do with anything to do with Entra at all. Now, on Entra level, I might be an admin, I might be just a simple user. Doesn't make any difference to me in Azure resources. Right now, in Azure, in this environment, in my subscription, I have an owner role, or on that resource that I'm creating, I have the owner role. I created it, it's my resource, it's mine, right? So in that case, I control everything around that resource. Now, what if I want you to collaborate with me on this? And I suggest, all right, cool, you can come and collaborate with a few other people that we are working with as a team, and the entire team can collaborate with me on that resource. Now, ideally, I wouldn't want to give you the owner role. We always go back with zero trust, the least privileged access that I can give you, just enough access for you to be able to perform your tasks, possibly just in time, but maybe that's for a conversation for another topic later. For now, just enough access is what we're going to implement. How do I control what you get access to? Well, giving you the owner role gives you too much power. You could take over the resource and kick me out. Not saying that you would, but you could. So what can I do? Well, there are other roles under RBAC that we can consider. We can consider a role that has slightly less privileges than an owner, and this is where we can look at another role called contributor. Let me just change the pen to a bit like that, and I can give you a contributor role, and you can come and collaborate with me on that using the contributor role. Excuse me. Now, being a contributor, you have full access to this resource. You can simply go in, edit this resource, create it, delete it, manage it. You can do all the stuff that I can do as an owner. The only thing that you are not given is just the permissions ability. So you're not able to change your permissions or someone else's permissions. So you can't invite somebody in, you can't remove someone else's permissions, you can't change your permissions. You can't mess with the permissions on this. So that's one thing that I can take away. Now, I could go into looking at assigning you a completely different role, or maybe another set of users that I have. I can give them a complete different set of roles in here. Again, there are many roles under RBAC that we can look into implementing. And so far, what I'm looking at is just general roles. Now, I could simply go in here and suggest, hey, I will give you a reader role. Now, with a reader role, you are not able to delete, create, or amend anything that's on that resource currently. You're simply able to connect to it, work with it, and that's it. So you are a reader. You have no permissions whatsoever in terms of performing any other task apart from a reader and look at that resource. So again, some control over what I want different users to be able to do in this environment. And again, that's something nice to look at. Now, this is interesting. However, let's add one more scenario to this. Like I said, these are typically general roles. Now, let's bring the scenario a little bit like this. Imagine I go back into creating that virtual machine just a little bit like this over here, so I can explain the next scenario. Like I said, this virtual machine will typically fall into a resource group. We'll call this RG1. Let's give this machine a name, VM1, and we drop this resource group into a subscription. Now, I'm just drawing the scope levels in terms of the rectangles or boxes that we have here. I'm hoping this is still okay for you to understand. So let's drop this as a subscription. So I have a subscription 1. Now, me creating this resource, being the owner of this resource, giving you access to be able to come and collaborate with me on this resource. Again, that's all good and well. But what about this? Let's change the scenario a little bit. Now, I don't necessarily just have one resource in here. I created a few of these resources in here. So let's say a few virtual machines, and let's drop them in a bit like so. And so I have a few virtual machines. Now, I want you to be able to collaborate with me on all of these, not just one. And I want to give you a contributor role on them all. But doing them one by one is too much time consuming. As administrators, we're always looking to find a way that's least admin effort. Not saying that we're lazy, just finding a way that we can achieve things much quicker rather than spending a lot of time in doing the same process. So instead of giving you access to these machines one by one, I could widen the scope and suggest, you know what, I'll give you access to the entire resource group that we have over here, and I can give you the contributor role. So you be the contributor for the entire resource group. Now, it would work well if that's all I had in the resource group. But what if I have other resources in here as well? For example, let's say I have a couple of databases in here. And bear with me, try the database again, and maybe an app service of some sort. So some other resources that live inside of this resource group as well. Now, this is where things look a little bit tricky. Why? Giving you a contributor to the entire resource group means that you can manage everything that's inside, delete, edit, amend everything apart from the permissions to entire resource group. So this brings me to a little bit of a tricky situation because I need to now manage some resources and not others. Now is it the time for me to give you access one by one? Well, maybe not. We can still find a better way. There are certain roles, like I mentioned, these roles that I was talking about, these are general roles. However, there are some specific roles that we can find. In this case, we can look for a role for you that will be a virtual machine contributor role. Now, this role is more limited in terms of a general contributor that can contribute to anything. And you will then be allowed to simply contribute just for the virtual machines. And I can assign that on a resource group level, which means that at a resource group, inside that resource group, any virtual machine you can contribute to. Other resources, you can't touch them. Again, I'm not giving you access for you to see them, read them, delete them, edit them, whatever. So this is something that we can look at in understanding different types of roles that exist out there. There's one more interesting role, however. For instance, right now, I give you the contributor role to the entire resource group, and I am no longer available to work with you in this environment. Maybe I've gone away for a holiday, a month long. That'll be nice. But I've gone away and I didn't add anybody else. Now, there's an urgent work needed. The company hires a new project manager and they want this project manager to be able to manage this project. Now, currently, they don't have access to this. Nobody else has access to this resource. There are some contributors that have access to this. They can't change permissions. That means they can't assign me permissions for me to be able to go into, or the new project manager to be able to go into managing some of these resources. What do? Well, we could look at someone who has a higher level of access, maybe someone who has access on the subscription where all of this belongs and they can make some changes. If I don't, and I'm still stuck, then in that case, we have another special role that's designed for this particular situation called User Access Admin. Now, User Access Admin is a special role designed just in scenarios like these, where this User Access Administrator should be able to go and change permissions. So a few things that they can do, or out of the few things they can do, they can see everything wherever their role is assigned, particularly on a subscription, and they can change permissions. They can also log tickets, but we'll leave the tickets out for today. They can change permissions. That's all they can do. They can't perform anything else. They can't go and make changes to resources and stuff like that directly. They need to assign themselves a different role to be able to do that. So just assigning this user access administrator should be able to allow, or assign this to myself or someone else, should allow them to go and change this PM's permissions, maybe make them an owner, again, least privilege access, whatever is required. You assign them the right role that they need to be able to work within this environment. Now, one interesting thing about the user access administrator role is this, that if you are creating some of that, typically your global administrator that you have in your environment in Entra, now we're bringing back Entra into conversation, typically nothing to do with Azure has anything to do with my Entra setup. In this case, the global administrator that I have in my tenant has an ability to go into my tenant to suggest, hey, I want to take control over the subscriptions and all the resources that we have in here. Now, if that's the option that they go and choose, given that they've enabled that feature, this should allow them to be able to go into any subscription and assign themselves a role. By default, it doesn't do anything. So it doesn't give you any special powers just because you are a global administrator, unless you toggle that option in your tenant. And when you come to Azure, you enable an RBAC role to yourself, which will be the user access administrator. So you must assign yourself an RBAC role in Azure to be able to do some of these changes. Once you're done with that, you remove yourself from that role. And again, people can carry on working within that environment. Now, this is just as a very quick overview of what RBAC looks like, how you manage permissions, who do you assign permissions to, what type of permissions and roles are there available for you to look at. Now, hoping this makes sense in terms of breaking it down as different roles and scope of it, let's have a look at this in Azure Portal. All right. For this part of the demonstration, we're jumping into my Azure portal on portal.azure.com, so we can have a look at some details in here. Now, just to have a quick look, let's zoom in a little bit. Currently, I've got my subscription running in here already, so I am simply going to go and tap onto my subscription and show you that in my subscription, I have the IAM on the blade for my subscription. Again, like I said, the scope, you have different scopes that we have available. Now, again, you can go into management groups, resources, or resource groups and find IAM in all this level of the scope that you have. And you can go into assigning permissions. For now, we'll stay in the subscriptions. Now, if I stay in my subscriptions and click on access control. Now, right in the bottom of my screen, I should be able to see some details around this. And if I wanted to assign the roles, I can simply go into roles that are currently available for me to look at. Now, very briefly, we spoke about a few of these roles. We spoke about what owner, contributor, and reader role looks like. And I did mention that these are general roles and they have some access. Now, if you want to know what type of level of access you can see, something similar to what you would normally do in your Entra environment to go into a role and see the permissions, you can do the same. You can go into an owner role, click on view what it looks like, and has tons and tons of permissions that are listed on the screen that tells you what an owner is capable of doing. However, if you're interested to see this in a JSON format, you can tap down JSON. Again, it's very, very readable. You can simply pick up some details from in here that this is the role name and this is the description of the role, and it's currently assigned at the root level. And currently the action that this role can perform is all. They can do everything. Are there any restrictions on this role? Well, no. Under not actions, I don't see any restrictions labeled. So as an owner, you should be able to do everything entirely in your environments. If you're the owner of a subscription, you can do whatever you like in that subscription. Create resources, delete, add others, permissions, all of that you can do. Similarly, you have the contributor role, you have a reader role, so you can look at some of the details. Feel free to go and explore them. We also mentioned a couple of other roles, like if I find virtual machine, and type in virtual machine contributor role. So this is a role that we spoke about earlier on. So you can see that that role that exists. If I need to give you abilities to go and manage the resource, not talking about logging in, but also managing the resource in terms of switching it on, off, adding different resources to it, then again, I could assign that to you. Now, like I said, this is more specific role. So it's not a general role, it's a compute role that I'm assigning to you. So it becomes more specific for a need that I have. Or one last role that we spoke about in the previous scenario was a user access admin to help me out when I'm stuck with permissions. Again, this is where you will look at the user access admin role. That can help me in doing some of that. So it lets you manage user access to Azure resources, and that's a general role. It's a built-in role that we have over here. Now, just to configure this, to allow the setting that I spoke about in the previous session, ideally you'll need to be in your Entra. And I'm back into my Entra portal. I'll simply click on my properties right over here, and if I scroll down to the bottom a little bit, I can see this small area that tells me access management for Azure resources, and I can take over control for my subscriptions and management groups in here, and all I need to do is toggle this box to a yes. Now this is where you will go into configuring that setting that I spoke about in the previous discussion. Once you've done that, you should be able to come in here, assign yourself a user access administrator, and manage your permissions over resources, or assign someone else permissions. Now, apart from looking at your roles and managing different roles, you can also create a custom role if you don't already find a role from the long list of roles that are available in here. Now, just to kind of show you, scrolling down, I have about, this is showing me one page with about a few results. There are about 786 results that it can show me. So currently that's all we are seeing. So again, if you don't find one from one of the lists that's in here, by all means, you could think of something like a mixture between a few. You can simply come in here and create a custom role if you don't find a role that suits your need. Now, for me to create a custom role, all I need to do is come in here and define a role. Let's say this is for special user, or special, let's say, app or resource admin. All right, again, we're creating a special resource admin with multiple permissions in one role. Again, this is my description for it, so by all means you can come up with whatever you like. Now, you could start with a clone of a role. Now, RBAC allows you to clone one of the existing RBAC roles, which is interesting. So you don't need to start from scratch. You can simply go in and say, hey, I want to clone one of the roles that's listed over here, and then add to it. By all means, you can do that. You can start from scratch. You can start from a JSON file. If you already have a file, upload it in here, and you can start creating that role by all means. Now, again, if you're starting from scratch, you will need to go into permissions. You need to go and add some more permissions to what this role is capable of doing. And you can come in here and start looking for what permissions that fits your need. And you can simply add them in here. Once you're happy with that, you can say, hey, what level is this role assignable? At the root level, maybe this role can only be assigned to particular resources or particular resource groups. You come here and define an assignable scope for you in terms of either it's going on a management group or if it's going into a particular subscription, so you know where this role can be assigned. Finally, you could see a JSON of what you've created so far, and when you're happy, you can simply click create and review, and you're done with creating a custom role. Again, if there was a need for it, you have the options to be able to create that under your subscriptions tab under creating add new role. Now, apart from assigning roles in Azure on your resources and giving people access to your resources, what if I have another scenario where I'm looking to allow resources talk to other resources, which is possible? Maybe I want my database talk to an application, an app trying to authenticate to the database and connect to it without asking for me to provide a username and password to the application, or creating a username and password for the application or for the database for it to authenticate. Now, in that case, if I wanted to do this, I would need to use something we refer as managed identities. Now, we can assign managed identities in your environment to a resource. Now, before I go into talking about how we manage them or how we assign them, there are two different types that we will discuss later on. One, that's called system assigned managed identity, which Entra or Microsoft Azure can handle that for me. It creates it automatically for me and assigns it for me automatically, maintains the life cycle of that identity by itself. And as and when the resource that I assign this to dies, it goes away with it. So I create a virtual machine and assign a managed identity to it. It maintains that automatically as long as the machine is available. Once the machine is gone, I delete it. it deletes the managed identity for me. That's a system assigned managed identity. However, I can create my own managed identities as a user. So I go and create my own managed identity. I create a resource and I assign that managed identity to that resource. That is what we refer as user assigned managed identity. And in this case, the life cycle of the managed identity is not dependent on the resource. If in future that resource goes away, I can separate that identity away from it and repurpose that to another resource. Maybe I create a virtual machine, I use it for 5 hours and I delete it. But during that time, it needs the identity mapped to it. So I create my own identity and assign to it. When I create this machine again to reuse it for another 5 hours, I assign the same managed identity to it and carry on using that. And again, this is just one example. There could be many different use case scenarios for why would you need to create your own managed identities. Now, before we do some of this, let's have a quick chat about this on a whiteboard. All right, now, for a simple understanding, typically, let's assume if a user was trying to gain access to an application. Let's say we have an app where a user is trying to log into. Now, that's perfectly fine. By all means, it can be between an app and a database, as we said before. User trying to connect to an app, that could be also fine as well. Or another resource. If you want to take an example, let's change that app to a virtual machine. Regardless, both is okay. Now, typically, I would need some sort of an access to that resource. Maybe a username and password for this machine. If it's a Windows device, then maybe I need a Windows username and password for me to log into this. And typically, we could use what we refer as a local admin username and password on your machine or on a virtual machine. And I could do that. I could simply go in, my user can log into that machine and simply authenticate themselves by using the user and password that was designed on that operating system as a local admin. However, if I was to share this with other people, imagine I have 20 people in my admin team, they're all new to manage this resource. If I was to share this user and password, I need to find a mechanism where I can do this securely. Now, ideally, sharing user and password over emails, over chat, over post-it notes, maybe not a secure idea. So for that reason, what we could do, we could come up with an idea where we could look into authenticating to this resource directly without having to provide it username and password. Now, how could I do that? Well, first of all, I would already be authenticated using my Entra in my environment. So why not use Entra as my authentication provider? So this is me trying to draw Entra. So we have Entra ID. I am already authenticated to Entra. Entra knows me already, maybe because I've logged into a device, maybe I've provided it with username and password. Now, when I try to log into this device, I would like this device to say, hey, user, go and authenticate me using your Entra details. And in this case, Entra authenticating me to that resource so I can log into it. Now, for this to happen, first of all, Entra needs to know who this machine is. How should it authenticate this user to that machine? Currently, this machine doesn't have an identity of any sort. It's just a resource in my environment. And this is where my managed identities come into play, where I can go and look at creating a managed identity or asking Entra or Azure to assign a managed identity to this resource. Once I do this, now Entra knows this identity resource. Again, we're managing this in our environment, and it can authenticate me against that identity. Now, the same process could happen if this machine was to talk to a database in my environment. Again, if they both have managed identities, they can authenticate themselves to the resource by just using their managed identities. No need for password creation, no need for password sharing, and making it more secure for resources to work. Now, let's have a quick look at this in action. Right. I'm back into my Azure portal by going into portal.azure.com. Now, in this portal, first of all, I could look into creating a managed identity for myself, as in for my use. And let's go into typing in manage identities and simply coming down here and clicking manage identities. Currently, I don't have any. Let's go into asking Azure to provision me one. And we'll drop this in an existing resource group that I have, or let's create a new one. Let's call this SC300 and say OK. The name for this managed identity is going to be MI1. That's my managed identity that I'm creating. Okay. I have some policies. Let's change some of these details to the policies. Okay. So I'm going to drop this resource in UAE North. Again, that's not something that you need to have all the time. This is just because of some other demos that I might have been running in here. I have some restrictions on that I need to take off, but we'll live with that for now. And currently, I'll leave this as... And again, I'll leave the isolation scope for now. I'll leave that alone and we'll simply create this. That's all I need to do to create a managed identity in my environment. Now, this is user assigned managed identity. I've created this identity. I requested Azure to help me create one. And this is where it's going to go provision that managed identity and have one available for me to use. Now, how do I use this? Well, typically, I would need to have a resource where I can go and apply this to. For instance, while this is deploying, let's go back into creating a virtual machine. Again, creating these resources is not part of this session, but I'm just simply going to go and show you some examples for this. So, for example, as a resource, if I was creating a virtual machine in my environment, and as part of the management section of the virtual machine, when I scroll down in here, it simply gives me some options over here to say, hey, would you want to log into this machine using your Entra details? And I'll be like, yeah, why not? I don't want to use username and password for this machine as a local admin. I want to do that. Now, if I tick this box, the system forces me to tick that box right above as well, which is, hey, we need to assign this resource a managed identity. Without the identity, Entra doesn't know what this resource is, like I explained earlier on. So it will automatically choose to assign one. Now, we could go and assign our own identity to this later, but to start, it needs to do that. However, along with that, it also suggests that, hey, if you're going to be doing this, you must assign the users who are going to log into this and authenticate some RBAC roles. What are these RBAC roles? There are some other RBAC roles that we haven't yet covered, like virtual machine administrator login, so they log into that machine as administrator, or a virtual machine user login, so they log in as end users on that machine. But they authenticate using their own username and password under Entra, but I must give them the RBAC role on that resource, so they are given that access. So this is their authorization of what level of access they would get. So again, this is some of what we would define when you're creating a machine. Now, let's have a quick look at one of the machines that I already have. So if I go into one of my existing machines and hide some of these menus on the blades, and this is my virtual machine blade. Now, again, for part of this session, we don't need to worry about the details that are on the virtual machine. The important part that I'm considering to discuss right now is the identity under the blade for the virtual machine on my Azure portal. And when I go into this, I can see that this already has a system assigned identity that's triggered on. So it already has a system assigned identity that's available for it. Now, if I wanted to go and assign a user identity, I can simply come in here and say, hey, let me add a new identity to this. We just created MI1. I want this to be allocated to it. I can add that. And then this is me manually assigning a managed identity, a user managed identity to this, whereas the system could already have one assigned to it. Now, this is an example of a virtual machine. Now, if I quickly jump onto another example, if I look at an application, again, just to quickly show, I have another resource called Web App. The Web App also has identities tab available under the blade. In here, I don't necessarily have any managed identity associated to this app. I can simply go and switch on, and this is where the system will assign it a managed identity. Or if I click on the user assigned, same process again, I can simply come in here and say, hey, I'm assigning you an identity. Now this managed identity would be the user assigned managed identity for this application assigned to it like so. And with that, we come to the end for the session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.